welcome to episode 66, Learning to Become. Today, we'll talk about something very interesting and something that you probably have heard about. Have you ever heard that English is the most important language in the world nowadays? So, today we're going to talk about why is English the most important language nowadays, and also what differs English from the other languages that were the most important language back in the day. For example, if we think historically, there are 6 languages that no longer exist that once they were very important. For example, Latin. That's the language that was the starting point for so many other languages, such as Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian, even partially English, but it no longer exists. Why is it? Or Coptic, that's also an Egyptian language, Hebrew, but the old Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew. Sumerian is also a language that was very popular back in the day. Akkadian, this one I had never heard about before, but it's from the Mesopotamian area. And it died a long time ago also. In Sanskrit language, which is related to from Nepal. That is so interesting. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about mostly why is English different from those other languages, and why probably English will not die like those other languages did. The answer is very short. We'll get to it here in a few minutes. But first, I want to tell you about the most popular languages right now. So if we think about today is January 2023, so we're going to use data information from 2022. And we're getting a website from Broward College, and the website is named lingua.edu. And they compiled a list of the 20 most spoken languages. And number 1 is English with 1.121 million speakers. Okay, so technically this 1.121 would be 1,121,000,000 speakers. Latin, or Mandarin, which is Chinese, is 1,001,007,000. Hindi is 698 million speakers. Spanish, there are 512 million speakers. Then we get French with 284 million speakers. Arabic with 273 million speakers. Bengali with 265 million people. Russian with 258 million speakers. Then we have Portuguese with 234 million speakers. Indonesian with 200 million speakers. So we got all the way down until number 10. So we covered 10 of the most spoken languages right now. And as you can tell, there is a a big difference from English to the next languages, right? To Mandarin, Chinese, Hindi, and the other ones. But I want to point out something very interesting in here. Mandarin Chinese it has a lot of speakers because China's population is massive. Just for you to have an idea, not everybody in China speak Mandarin Chinese. They speak some local languages, dialect, and stuff like that. But still, they have over 1 billion speakers of Mandarin Chinese. And the same thing with Hindi, which is a language from India. Not everybody in India speak Hindi, but still they have almost 700 million speakers, which is a lot of people. And out of those places, out of China or out of India, not everybody speak, or not a lot of people speak Chinese and Hindi. Even though Mandarin Chinese is kind of spreading because of business, we have an information that's very interesting. And I learned this information from a Brazilian entrepreneur from the language industry. His name is Flávio Augusto. And he shared maybe last year or the year before the last, can't remember, but he shared an information that was very impacting to me, that was very strong. He said, only in China, there are more people learning English than the United States' entire population. For you to have an idea, the US population here, the US, let me look it up. Population is 331 million.9 people. In China alone, only in China, there are more than 400 million people learning English, which means there are more people learning English in China than the United States' entire population. And it answered one question that's very commonly asked, which is, won't Chinese or won't Mandarin Chinese overtake English as the most important language of the world? And I think the answer is pretty clear. If there are more people in China learning English than the United States' entire population, it clearly sends a message that Chinese or that China or that human beings, including the Chinese, are every day getting more and more adapted to English than the world getting adapted to Chinese Mandarin. So this is something very interesting that we have to think about when we consider how important English is, and when we consider that English could become like a dead language or no longer so important as it is today. So to think about it, let's consider this information about English. Yeah, and so continuing with this observation about locals speaking their own language, I want to point out that English is number one by far. And then second place, we would have Spanish, right? Because there are 19 countries in the Americas, one in Africa, plus Spain that's speaking Spanish. So they have a lot of speakers just because it is something almost like the same as China and India. there are a lot of countries that speak Spanish. And of course, there are lots of countries that speak English too. We could mention a lot of African countries, the United States, Canada, countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago. We would also consider like the European countries that speak English. So there are a lot of people that speak English, but all that to say that which I'm considering the second most spoken language in the world, which is Spanish, because we're talking about different locations, not only inside one country, like would happen with Chinese and Hindi. From the number one, which is English, in my analysis in here with you guys, to the second place, which is Spanish, we're talking about a 50% decrease. So there are 1.121 billion speakers of English and only 512 million Spanish speakers. And right, when I say only, I don't know why I say only, because it is a lot of people. But if you speak English, your possibilities are a lot higher and a lot bigger than if you speak any other language. And if we consider Portuguese, which is my mother tongue, we are talking about a number of 234 million speakers. Only in Brazil, we are over 200 million people, which means that majority of Portuguese speakers are located in Brazil. And there are a few countries in Africa, also Portugal, and maybe, I don't know if is there any other country in Central America that speaks it. But as you can see, not a lot of people considering the world's entire population. So if the dead languages died, and I want to talk a little bit more about them, we're using a website called bilingua.io to talk about it. And we will read some important information about each one of those languages before we get to the answer. What makes English different from all those other languages? And why is English more important than that? Not necessarily more important, because historically they are very important, but what makes English special when compared to those languages? And the first one is Latin. And when we talk about Latin, it says Latin is by far the most well-known dead language. Though it has been considered a dead language for centuries, it is still taught in school as an important way to understand many languages. So, 1 century is 100 years. And the text is saying that Latin is a dead language for centuries, which means more than 200 years at least. We could think about 500 years maybe. But it's still important because it is a way to understand many other languages. Latin was originally spoken by people living along the lower Tiber River. The geographical area that uses Latin spread with the Roman Empire. So Latin was so popular because of the Roman Empire back in the day. And it says that the language made its way through Europe and across the Western Mediterranean coastal regions of Africa, partly because of its incredible complexity, but also due to other forces. Latin died out with the Roman Empire. It was, however, incorporated into various other languages, and some would say evolved into languages many people speak today. These include French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. So it is saying that Latin died with the Roman Empire because Latin was, as far as I know, a Roman Empire official language that was like their language, and they would speak this language, and they were the most influential government, the most influential power in the time. So they would conquer many lands, many areas, and that would make the language spread because they were spreading out geographically always. And as a result, more people would speak their language. But this perspective is interesting because some people say that Latin just evolved into many other languages, like French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Romanian. And just a fun fact, I worked at an American company, and we had people working from Romania. Actually, the biggest office of the company, even though it was, or it still is, an American company, the biggest office is in Romania. And the fun thing is that it's actually very interesting. Romanians have or a lot of Romanians, at least the ones I got to know, they speak so many languages. Like some of them would speak 4, 5, 6 languages, like French, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, English. Some would speak languages like German, Russian, I don't know, some crazy languages that are not, I mean, the languages are not crazy, like crazy. But when I say crazy languages, I mean, they're very difficult considering my culture and where I'm from, because I speak a Latin-based English language. So if we go into some language like German or Russian, it gets too complicated. It is something very difficult. So that's why I've always been impressed with their ability to speak so many languages. The second language that's been dead for a while is this Coptic, which says is what remained of the ancient Egyptian language. Yes, even hieroglyphics. Coptic is a combination of hieroglyphics, Demotic, and hieratic languages. It was used throughout Egypt by the Ptolemaic rulers after the spread of Greek culture throughout the region. If you want to speak like the ancient Egyptian did, Coptic is for you. Coptic now only exists in the liturgy of the Coptic Church in Egypt. It is considered the first language of Christianity by some, and is no doubt important for understanding the early origins of Christianity. It has recently lost the last of its native speakers and is becoming a language that more or less exists mainly for scholars of dead languages. In other words, this language, which is an Egyptian language, died, and it's used nowadays only for their, like the Egyptian church related service, and that's about it according to the text. Like there's not many things related to the language other than people that study languages, and it's something very interesting. So in the same way as we can think of the Roman Empire, if we think about Egypt, they have been once a force, like the power of the world, the most important country. If we look back in the days, like long time ago, Egypt was the most influential country on earth. And that would strongly affect and influence the spread of the language and the possibility of its spreading out over all the place. And that's something really cool to consider. So we can kind of recognize a pattern in here that a language doesn't become an important language just because, like, oh, it sounds beautiful, or we like it, oh, it is an interesting language. No. Languages become important because of the people that carry that language with them. It's not about, oh, it's a phonetic, interesting language, or the sounds are cool, or oh, I really like the way the words are written. No. What makes a language popular and important is who speak that language and how important and how influential those people are to the world. And in the same way, the third language is the biblical Hebrew, and it says is not to be confused with the modern Hebrew. That's the first thing. There is the modern Hebrew and there is the old biblical Hebrew. But the modern Hebrew is a language that is still very much alive. So there are still people that talk in Hebrew, but the modern Hebrew, not the old Hebrew. Biblical Hebrew refers to an archaic form of Hebrew that developed into a literally and liturgical language around 200 years CE. It was originally spoken by ancient Israelites. It is currently taught in public schools in Israel as an important way to understand modern Hebrew and the Jewish faith. In other words, they still study in school just to understand the modern language, which means modern Hebrew is a variation of the old Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew. And it also used to explain the Jewish faith. Since modern Hebrew was an evolution of biblical Hebrew, and this still contains many biblical elements, biblical Hebrew is relatively easy for native Hebrew speakers to understand. So for people that speak Hebrew, the biblical Hebrew is not so difficult for them to understand. Got it? Number 4, Sumerian. The ancient Sumerians are most well known. Quick pause. So about the biblical Hebrew. The Hebrews, they've been very influential over the course of history as well. Just like we mentioned about the Roman Empire in the Egypt. They've actually, the Hebrews, they've actually navigated through different seasons, and they lived inside Egypt. They've lived in places where the Roman Empire was, but they've never been eliminated. And that's one thing to consider about the two languages that we mentioned previously, like the Latin and the Coptic. Hebrew is still alive, but it's in a different form. So it is really interesting. Then we have number 4, which is Sumerian. The ancient Sumerian are most well known for being the first civilization to invent a system of writing. That is crazy. Their language didn't fare as well as their legacy. Sumerians has not had any native speakers in centuries, but their cuneiform tablets are still studied by scholars all around the world. These cuneiform tablets describe Sumerian laws, myths, and stories, painting a precious picture of Sumerian society. So this language is important because they created the first system of writing. How crazy, how important, how nice is that when we're talking about communication? But they haven't had anybody that spoke that language as their primary language for centuries. We're not talking about 20, 50 years. No, we're talking about 500 years, about centuries. And as the Sumerian Empire declined, the population made a move to the north. They were searching for more fertile, farming grounds, as well as a more hospitable place to settle their society. They did not fare so well, however. Eventually, the ancient Sumerians merged with the Akkadians, both in culture and in language. So pretty much they were transitioning, going from place to place, and they were trying to find a place where, after their empire declined, they started to move, trying to find a place to settle their society. Place where they could have more plants, where the ground was better, and also a place where it would be hospitable, which means where people would receive them well, so they could settle their society, their nation in. And in this process, they merged, they connected, they made some sort of alliance with the Akkadians, both in culture and language. And that's the fifth language we'll be talking about, this Akkadian. It didn't stand the test of time either, as it turns out. It was spoken throughout Mesopotamia from the 3rd to the 1st millennium BCE. This language spread across an area that stretched all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. The Akkad dynasty ruler, Sargon, led this great expansion of the Akkadian Empire. So in different words, what it is saying is that this language, these people, they expanded so much. They went from Mesopotamian, Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. So they got a big piece of land. Their empire was very big. And the revitalization of Akkadian and Sumerian, for that matter, is as interesting a story as the story of how these languages died out. So after centuries of laying dormant, scholars in the 19th and 20th century were able to decipher the meaning of these ancient languages and to bring them back to life in some way. The excavation work of these scholars has gone a long way in introducing new insights into these ancient societies. So those are like dead languages, because people were studying the meanings to try to get something. So just for us to consider, we covered 5 languages so far. Latin is the base for many languages. Biblical Hebrew in some form is still around with the modern Hebrew that continue exist with the Hebrew people. Sumerian and Akkadian, they were completely extinguished from the world. And then we have Sanskrit language. Is the ancient language of Hinduism and is used in many religions. These include Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Sanskrit, and serves as the main language of a lot of ancient poetry, drama, and religious text. So this language is present into some cultural aspect related to religion, and its permanent role in literary tradition makes it an incredibly important language for many scholars to understand. It is a complex language that has hundreds of words for single meanings or objects. Many would argue, though, that Sanskrit is not a dead language after all. There is still about 1,600 people in Nepal that can claim Sanskrit as their native language. So a lot of people say that this language is not dead because there are like 1,600 people in Nepal that says this is their native language. So Sanskrit is miraculously not quite dead yet, though it is largely a language used for the study of ancient academic texts. It is still being used colloquially by some people. And then we covered all of those languages. But what does all of those languages have to do with English? Why did Latin, Coptic, the Biblical Hebrew, Sumerian, Akkadian, and the Sanskrit died? Like what is the difference from those languages in English? As we learned, what matters is not the language for the language's sake. A language is not important because it is nice, because it is beautiful, because, I like it. That's not what makes a language important. What makes a language important is actually who carries that language. Who are the people, the society that speak that language? And that is so important because we are in a very different time from when those people lived. Back in the day, we're talking about a domain of land, a geographical domain, and people would conquer more power. Their empires would expand and grow based on the amount of land, of geographical expansion they had. But in the time we live, especially considering the internet, we no longer fight for land or geography. So what do countries fight for? Like what's the power race they are in right now? Because if we understand that, we can understand better why English, in my opinion, will not fade away like those languages did. Let me see one thing. Yeah, so that is so interesting because thinking historically, right, and using this example from the dead languages, those countries were fighting for land, for geography, they were fighting each other. But if we bring it to the modern economy and to the modern world, countries fight economically, but not geographically. And they fight economically by the way they produce money, the way their countries get wealthy. And if we think about it today, the two biggest countries language-wise are China and the United States, because they're economically very strong in their deals. They produce a lot of money in the world. But also there is another element that English is by far the most important. And I think Korean may be getting a lot of room in there too, but English is still by far the most important, which is culture, including art like music, cinema, nowadays with the series, TV shows and stuff. Also books, people write books every day. And also about studies, like scholars every day, they write articles. And even if they are from India, Brazil, Russia, Japan, Australia, I mean, anywhere in Africa, in the Americas, in Europe, they will write their articles in English because it makes more sense to them. They want more people to have access to the information they are producing. And the best way to do it is by creating an article in English, because more people will have access to this article. So it is very interesting for us to consider and to understand this. And I think that's the difference between Latin, Biblical Hebrew, and all the other dead languages that we mentioned. It is not only so much the language, but it's the way the world works. And there is one word that makes it all so different: globalization. Back in the days, those guys, they didn't have it. The world was very local. For you to send a message from, I don't know, like from Africa to Europe, you needed, that was very difficult. You needed a messenger, somebody by horse, carrying on like the message in a bag. For days, sometimes months, just to deliver a message. And nowadays, those messages, they're delivered like literally instantly. And this changes the game. If we consider that, it is a game changer, because speaking English is not only good for the English-speaking countries right now. English is no longer a language of the English-speaking countries. It has become a language of the world, because everybody benefits from it somehow. So I don't think English will die, because it's no longer being protected by a group of people, like from the British or from Americans. No, we're actually very thankful because of the way it's been used over the last century, the last few centuries, and the way it's spread, because it connects the world. English connects the world. It's the bridge that shares information all over. So this is very beneficial to a lot of people. And when we think about economy, which is one of the factors, The big companies are the ones that produce more money, and their entire ecosystem works in English. Any big company you can think of, if you think about Apple, Nike, car companies like Toyota, which is a Japanese company, Adidas, Samsung, Amazon, Tesla, the social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, even though they're not all of them are Americans or British, but all of them have their internal structure in English because it makes sense, and that is globalization. And that's the word that changes the game when it comes to the expansion and establishment of languages. So that's why English is not going to die, or not anytime soon, while the world still works the way it does today. The other languages died because of the system the world worked. Power, conquering physical land, geographic expansion, but it's no longer what we see. So while the world is the world of the internet, English will still be the most important language. It could be for another 100 years, could be for another 50 years, not 50 years, but unless something like there is a war and all the information is lost, and then there is no more internet, and we get back to the ancient times. As that saying goes, I don't know how the Third World War will be, but for sure the fourth will be with stones and rocks. So sometimes some people said it, or wood and stone. Somebody said it, that they had no idea how the Third World War would be, but for sure the fourth one would be like we wouldn't have the resources we have today, not even the evolution in regards to equipment and tools. So it would be a war of stones, woods, and rocks, and just like something very primitive. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, while the world works the way it does, information, access, globalization, social media, instant information, people trying to connect and communicate to each other. While the world works the way we see it working today, English will continue to be the most important language because it's more convenient. It's one of the easiest languages to learn and to develop. It has already many local adaptations. There are so many different people that speak English, different accents. So that's my opinion on this. And that's why I think English will remain the main and most important language for many, many years. I would guess centuries. But I won't be here to test it, to witness that happening. But I truly think that that's the main difference between English and the dead languages. It's not even the language itself, but it's the time or which we live in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, share with a friend. And thank you so much. I appreciate you listening to it. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.